Could there be a more perfect haunted house to visit on Halloween than Arkham Asylum? And please welcome your two wards for the evening on All Hallows Eve. And that is, of course, going to be two very perfect figures that I came across at the most opportune moment. Out of all the holidays throughout the year that are most fitting of these two characters, Halloween, we got Black Mask as Batman and Scarecrow from the DC Classics interpretation, both being brought forward by McFarlane Toys at, like I said, the perfect arrangement of time throughout the year. And the first one I'm going to tackle here is going to be the Black Mask as Batman, which is, initially I was having a bit of a Mandela effect, thinking that it was pulled from like a comic that I may have missed, some kind of interpretation, some story arc that I wasn't aware of, but as I kind of did a little bit of my digging, a little bit of my quick Google search, it doesn't really seem like there's an actual property that this is from. Like, everything was kind of murky. If any of you have any kind of inside knowledge as to where it is that this was pulled from, this specific design of having the Rogues Gallery villain, Black Mask, donning the cape and cowl to then go into Arkham Asylum for some nefarious purpose, then please let me know, because I actually don't have too much knowledge into this arc, into this interpretation, this portrayal. All I know is that it at least gave McFarlane to give us a really awesome, badass looking head sculpt on an already existing and much more lucrative body sculpt. One that kind of had me fooled for a little bit. When this guy was first revealed, I thought to myself, I was really distracted. I was most notably and almost justifyingly distracted by the awesome head sculpt with the skull kind of protruding from the face there. That is, of course, indicative of Black Mask. That was then kind of pulling my gaze, my attention away from the fact that that utility belt looked awfully familiar. And once I saw some of those in-hand photos, I started to see much more people coming across it out in the wild during their hunts. That's where it dawned on me that that utility belt has been witnessed and even covered on the channel before. And it's that of none other than the DC Reborn, or Batman Reborn Batman, which is of course the Dick Grayson version of Batman, donning the cowl and the suit right here. And you can see right here that the body sculpt is arguably the same. In fact, hell, the utility belt, probably the biggest indicative factor of it being a simple repaint, is more or less the same shade. Okay, if I was to kind of play devil's advocate here, no pun intended, it would be that maybe the utility belt on the Black Mask is a bit more opaque on that bronze or that gold, copper-ish, champagne gold sort of color scheming to it, whereas the DC Batman Reborn is a bit more on the saturated side once you put them kind of next to each other. Apart from that, if you're looking for any major changes or variances as far as the sculpt is concerned, no, it's quite frankly identical beat for beat. In regards to the gauntlets, you'll notice right there that not only the spikes and the hooks on the side of the forearms are identical, but you even have the style to the actual padding around the wrist that even kind of cuffs a little bit of the wrist articulation, one of the little qualms I was pointing out while covering the original Dick Grayson Reborn Batman. And then when it comes down to every little minutia of the sculpt in and of itself, when it comes to maybe even the boots, the little wrinkles around the sides of the crotch area, the diaper piece, and even a little bit of that sculpting to make it look like it's actual textured suit amongst the thighs, the forearms, the biceps, the shoulders, and even a little bit around the abdominal area, is literally beat for beat, exactly one-to-one replications. The only major overhaul that is probably the biggest difference is the one that you can obviously tell, which is the color scheme overhaul. One that I'll admit is pretty fitting for that of Black Mask. I really do enjoy the fact that we swapped in the gray for the black. It has a little bit more of a glossy sheen to it. I don't know if maybe that's like a printing thing. I don't know if maybe that was a mess up on my particular unit, but I personally do like the approach to having it be a little less matted than the original Reborn and having it kind of have this slimy feel, considering that we are witnessing a villain donning the mask and kind of passing himself off as Batman. So it's kind of fitting for the personality. And then amongst that, I really do like the clash of the black up against that tealish, I don't want to say turquoise, I want to say it's more like a teal blue that is matching the gauntlets, the boots, the crotch piece, and most indicative there, the bat symbol up on the chest that unfortunately, well, it really depends on who you're asking. Some people might like this, some people might not like it. I'm kind of indifferent to the fact that the bat symbol didn't get altered. It simply just got a color swap, but other than that, I was kind of hoping that maybe they would change a few little details, a few nuances to the bat symbol to make it look a bit more nefarious and fitting of it being a much more villainized, quote unquote, version of the bat symbol, but it's quite literally the exact same one as the one Reborn Batman over here. And with the exception of the color swap, even the cape is exactly the same, made out of a nylon felt good fabric, with the wire pretty strong and attached to the trimmings, the edges here of the cape in and of itself. And it's so identical that it even managed to replicate a few of the issues that it did have with the stitching and the tucking of the cape into the neck area, to the point where you even have a little bit of this lifted sort of stitching on the left side, quite literally on the left side, on both, to the point where I thought it was maybe a QC problem in my specific black mask, and I thought to myself, God damn it, why did I come out where it has a little bit of a loose string that could pose a bit of a problem later on if I were to give it an accidental tug and it starts to undo the stitching of the wire and do the stitching and the application of the cape into the piece itself. But from what I can tell, it looks like Reborn Batman has that same exact little problem on his left that is literally identical there. So unfortunately, that seems like it's a problem that they didn't exactly fix, and it's something that maybe they could have refined in their method, their approach to incorporating the stitched felt good cape with the wire inside of that specific neck piece, which from what I can tell is completely unaltered as well. The biggest change is of course going to be the obvious hook as to why you're going to pick this guy up in the first place, especially if you already own the Reborn Batman, and that's going to be that immaculate skull-like head sculpt that to mimic that of Black Mask. That was arguably the moment that my eyebrows raised when this guy was initially revealed, and they did a pretty damn good job of replicating that very haunting look from the back art that you see on the back of the box, where you have the actual crevices for the eye sockets, the very chiseled out hollowness to the nose crevice, as well as of course the teeth, the cheekbones. I'm a sucker for whenever McFarlane is able to sculpt out a really decent looking skull, especially since it is up their wheelhouse. It's something that, you know, McFarlane has a huge thing for, because he manages to bake it into all of his designs for Spawn, from the comics to the movies to the every kind of IP that Spawn has brandished. There's always some kind of skull-like sort of attribute or characteristic, and so whenever they incorporated into one of their figures, specifically one pulled from the DC Multiverse line, I have some slight high expectations. So I'm pretty happy to see that Black Mask was able to at least match a good amount of those standards with this incarnation, as far as the way that the paint really does start to have this bit of a weathered effect to give it much more presence to the skull. As you kind of rotate around, you have a few of those little cracks in the cranium that then lead us on over to these really warped, but I mean this in a good way, because generally when you're dealing with plastic, you're thinking that the warped is kind of a criticism or a defect on the body sculpt itself or any kind of pieces of the plastic. But here they did something with the ears to give it this kind of, like I said, cranial sort of characteristic that matches that of the rest of the head sculpt, and therefore it looks immaculate as far as looking at it from different angles. Of course, in order to do so, I feel like you're more often than not going to have to turn the whole figure onto itself, because that's probably the only major sort of trade-off that you're dealing with, having to deal with a much more broadened out head sculpt that's arguably going to have to be, by default, wider than that of the Reborn Batman, is because you are dealing with a Black Mask head sculpt to give it this haunting look. And therefore, you're gonna have to sculpt out a piece that is a little bit more dense in all dimensions. And as such, it does sort, if you couldn't already tell from a bit of the squeaking, somewhat tighten around the head joint. So when it comes to articulation of the head joint, it is a little stagnant and a little bit stiff when rotating it the full 360 degrees, to the point where I did get a little nervous turning it all the way around. It's doable, but you're going to have to give it some major loosening up, either with a blow dryer or some kind of hot water application, you name it. But you are going to have to do a little bit of homework to get this guy to loosen up just a tad bit, because they did manage to sculpt out a different headpiece. But this is just an educated guess, but from what I can tell, it looks like maybe they kept the ball joint inside the same dimensions as that of the Reborn Batman. And of course, it's fitting over there since he's got a slimmer head, since it's just a standard human Batman cowl head sculpt. Here, it's a completely different beast, and as such, the tilting from side to side does get a little limited because you got a little bit of extra plastic due to the jawbone, as well as the mouthpieces, and of course the sides of the cranium, and then tilting up and down leaves a little bit to be desired. So yeah, if you are willing to sacrifice just a bit of the head articulation, it is a fine, very Halloween-esque and horror-themed head sculpt to look at. In regards to the rest of the articulation, I'm not really going to cover it since, again, as I mentioned before, it's quite literally the exact same body sculpt as that of the DC Reborn Batman. So if you guys want to check out beat for beat each point of articulation in broad detail, you guys can check out that review because it's there where I covered it in a much more deep dive fashion. Whereas here, you could just tell from this little time lapse here that the articulation is pretty much one for one exactly the same. So all of the little positives and negatives from that segment are going to carry on over here. And likewise, they're also going to come with almost the same amount of hand accessories. Of course, by default, you got these gripping hands, and then on the side, you're going to have these extended clenching hands. Ideally the same, only this time, of course, they're going to be matching the appropriate colors. So you're going to have black over here, and then that teal, darker blue over here. The only thing I will note is that one thing that I do think is a bit of a defect, a bit of a QC problem, since I don't remember facing this with the Reborn Batman, is that the right joint, for some strange reason, when swapping out any of the hand accessories, has a problem of being a little overly loose. Very easy to have the gripping hands just come off at a moment's notice whenever trying to move the hand joint or the wrist joint inside of that cuff. So I don't know if maybe that's just a very specific isolated problem to my unit here, or if any of you guys happen to have the Black Mask as Batman figure that just came out, please let me know in the comments if you guys are facing that issue as well. However, we start to deviate here in some really interesting character-driven choices for the accessories, because Reborn Batman comes with, of course, the electrifying hand brass knuckles, fist knuckles, the electrifying knuckles, so to speak. I don't exactly remember what the terminology for them are, but they are pretty neat, and like I said, very fitting for Batman, or at least the Dick Grayson Batman, to be able to utilize. Whereas Black Mask as Batman has some very fitting accessories that are replicated from that art on the back of the box that, again, is really cool, albeit a little superfluous, because you do have a set of keys that are probably going to grant him access to several different wings of Arkham Asylum. So you have these bronze-colored keys right here. They, unfortunately, are not functionable. They're simply just a rubberized, sculpted plastic with a little loop here, and then, of course, the keys are able to bend to kind of limit the chances of them potentially breaking in the future. There is a little part of me that kind of wishes that they were, and when I say functionable, I don't necessarily mean that they're going to open anything, but just, have them have this little, added quality of life detail to have the keys actually move within the loop here, almost as if it was a form of miniaturized keychain. That's just me speaking, just rambling about. But to me, the biggest draw that I do think is pretty neat, and like I said, very character-centric, and to be honest, it's probably my favorite accessory out of the bunch, would have to be this designated syringe hand for the left. Of course, lifted from the art that you see on the back of the box, and I do like the little bit of paint applications for the green in the middle of the syringe, as well as the bronze-colored, very similar to that of the keys, and I do kind of wish that they would have been a little bit more careful when applying said paint deco, since you do have a little bit of it splotched on the top side of the hand there. You'll notice that you do have a little bit of a QC there. So I don't know if maybe, again, that's just mine, or if this is a widespread issue. Nevertheless, though, it's meant for it to fit on his left hand, and when you kind of incorporate all these things together, you do have this overall really cool image to Black Mask as Batman that's just full on ready for the shelf. And albeit, again, you don't really have very clear, kind of functionality with the keys outside of simply just having him hold it. And again, it's probably preferable to have him hold it on the left hand as opposed to the right. That's already facing a little bit of a loose issue with that joint that makes it a bit of a chore to fit those keys in, but you kind of have to do it by default since the left hand is going to be taken up by the syringe. So now I'm kind of left with this really loose wrist joint that comes off very, very easily, especially when he's holding the keys that add a little bit of weight. So that's just something to keep in mind should that be a widespread issue with the looseness of the way that they sculpted out the peg inside of the wrist joint to then fit the hand. I honestly don't know why it is that that's a problem, and I know that it's a problem that wasn't lifted from the Reborn Batman, so something must have happened in that window of process. But so far, Black Mask as Batman, once you're able to swallow the fact that he is in fact a repaint of the reborn Dick Grayson Batman, that head sculpt, the added accessories do give it this spooky flair that I'm willing to bite this time. I just hope that we don't necessarily see an influx of a bunch of reborn Batman repaints, just like we were having with the Nightfall buck, simply out of the amount of times that this guy has already been picked up by several collectors, myself included. And Black Mask as Batman is able to extract a 7 out of 10 from me. Now, this guy I was personally really excited for because he just popped right out of the images when he was first unveiled with the promo art, and there were leaks kind of superseding this. And so I thought to myself, yes, a definitive Scarecrow. If only we can kind of give the same treatment over to a character like Poison Ivy. But for now, I would argue that in terms of leaning towards the horror aesthetic and also bringing about a very definitive look to, in my opinion, one of my favorite rogues gallery of villains for Batman, it would have to be Jonathan Crane, aka Scarecrow here, pulled from a DC Classics sort of interpretation, complete with a straw hat, of course the ropes, everything that has all of the very fine details that make Scarecrow what he is, popping off of those comic book panels and giving him that very menacing horror theme look. And here you got the burlap sack, you have of course the brown look and color scheming, along with some really icky, almost booger-like consistency to some of the paint apps utilized for certain sections of the overall ensemble, particularly the shoes and the gloves that have like kind of like this marbleized, gloopy, and like I mentioned before, very boogery aesthetic to the way that the plastic looks. And it may not necessarily fly everybody's boat as far as how those little details kind of come about here in physical format, but at the same time, to me, it just kind of works into having it this very off-put basis, this off-put sort of appearance to Scarecrow that again makes him look all that much more terrorizing to me. And as we look at the more dominant color of the overall outfit, which would have to be this very muted down brown color to kind of give it this burlap sap sort of appearance to the texture work, especially the one that's happening around here, around the tunic area for the mid-torso, and a little bit of what's kind of being strapped together around the waist area. They did a really immaculate job of kind of painting in some of these little details in terms of having it look like a burlap sack and having all the little crinkles, everything kind of being pulled and tossed together here towards the back, as well as a little bit towards the front. If anything, there's probably a little bit left to be desired in regards to the proportions. I will admit that he's looking a little bit jacked for a very scrawny, very emaciated character like Jonathan Crane has a tendency to be. So when it comes to this middle part right here, I do think that he probably prioritized torso, backs, lats, trapezius, and a little bit of the abdominal area, a bit more than he prioritized leg day or even a little bit in the arms department in regards to his sessions over at the gym. So you'll notice that maybe that might kind of turn off certain people a little bit away from picking up this definitive Scarecrow, but at the same time, it's something that I can kind of call out in terms of appearance, and yet for some strange reason, it's not necessarily a deal breaker for me in regards to an action figure of Scarecrow, because at least it's, like I mentioned before, leading off to that uncanniness, that off-putting quality to Scarecrow that he's meant to be, especially since he is utilizing a fear toxin, and it's kind of making you, it would kind of make somebody second guess the appearance of Scarecrow here and whether realizing if he's human or not. So to me, it's kind of working in character, it's working in universe in regards to these proportions, but I don't necessarily blame anybody for maybe looking at some of these proportions and thinking to themselves, and that's a little strange. If anything, there's a little bit of cross-pollination or cross-opinion sort of bleeding into each other within that Venn diagram in regards to the legs. The legs would probably be the only area where a bit of that proportionality or disproportionality, so to speak, does in fact sort of make me raise my eyebrows just a tiny bit in regards to how lanky they start to get here towards the bottom, where it gets a little bit too skinny for my taste. But on the bright side, it just gives us further little details that really sell the character in regards to these little patches that you can find a bit on the thighs, as well as a little bit of the tattered, really ripped apart, clothy look to the cuffs and kind of like the ankle areas right here that then leads us to the boots. And speaking of those little cuffy areas, again, like I mentioned before, the rubberized plastic utilized to make it look like it's threads and rips of the cloth here around the quote-unquote skirt area that is then tied together with this rope, and then you see a little bit of the straw kind of appearing from underneath the wrist cuffs right about right here that kind of sell the imagery of the character. And to kind of make some broader efforts in selling that imagery, we have this little collar piece that is meant to be kind of like an extension of the burlap sack that's covering up his head, except you'll note that it is a loose piece, and sometimes it has a tendency to kind of finagle and get in the way a little bit when handling the figure. But on the bright side, they did a really good job of kind of applying some really neat paint deco to the surface texture to kind of sell that little bit of clothy look that really makes the illusion come alive even better. But staying thematic to head sculpts that really sell these terrifying figures, I would argue that the biggest draw to me for this Scarecrow figure that I witnessed from the promo photos, and thankfully doesn't let anything down here in the final product release, would have to be this classic Scarecrow head sculpt with the very menacing face there covered up by the burlap sack, the stitching for the smile, the red eyes, and in my opinion, the best texture work that I've seen in a really good while, that I just couldn't help but just marvel at the look of this head sculpt in terms of the texture work, the paint applications. This is solid. This is where you really can see how McFarlane can really play to their strengths if they just kind of knuckle down and focus. And here, I feel like this is one of the finer examples of that. Then covered up by the straw hat right here, made out of course, like another sort of burlap-y style of texture that's being held together by more of this little rope texture happening around the rim here that then gets up here. I don't know exactly what the specific term for this part of the hat is, but then you have this really torn up brim of the hat that again just sells the overall image and illusion of the Scarecrow here, that to me, I almost want to argue that I really want to see more of these versions of Scarecrow that are not necessarily terribly realistic, but still get interpreted in some way or another in live action. I don't know what it is, but I just hope that Scarecrow could be done justice with a sort of approach to the visual style as this. But it's cool to see that DC Multiverse is not afraid to lean in that direction with this DC Classics line, and this could hopefully open up some doors for some overdue figures. Like I mentioned before, a lot of people are calling for Poison Ivy. Hell, I'm not the biggest Poison Ivy fan. I'm not. I like her enough, but I don't love her. But I just know that she's been on several collectors' lists, and frankly, I feel like McFarlane should do it. They should really just get it out there, especially if we are getting a little tumultuous here with the whole licensing fiasco. There's been some conflicting reports recently that we're going to get an additional 6 months in 2026, or they could be working out some deal where everybody can win. I don't know. But should there be a stopping point, then I feel like Poison Ivy, now finally getting Scarecrow out of the way, I feel like a classics Poison Ivy, a classic Two-Face of some sort that's not like Silver Age based or anything like that, or even animated series, just something very definitive. The way that they handled Scarecrow here would be really, really awesome. I just hope that whatever of the incarnations that we get from those other characters in the DC Classics line, pulled from DC Multiverse here by McFarlane, are handled a little bit better in regards to the articulation, because I will admit that as much as I love this head sculpt, there is a little bit of tightness that you might have already noted there when moving the head sculpt about, because rotating 360 is doable, but you'll hear an awful lot of squeaking there, and that's already passing the whole figure over with a hair dryer. And even at the highest setting, it still managed to revert back after a handful of uses. After cooling down after a few minutes, I noted that it still managed to re-tighten up again. So I don't know if there's any other form to give it a permanent solution, but you'll note right there that turning it 360 can still have a slight little bit of a force kind of repelling back there, and tilting up and down, it can definitely be done. I definitely feel some tilting, some solid tilting happening up and down and even side to side, but just mind a little bit of the looseness by this color piece that I mentioned before, to the point where rotating the head 360, you'll note that then you'll find the knot of the rope holding it together, so to speak, now reverting back to facing the front, which is not supposed to be there. It's supposed to be here towards the back, and oriented this way. So you're going to have to do a little bit of extra housekeeping when handling the head joint all around. When handling the arms, they can fully rotate 360, no problem, and extend off over to the sides, no problem. You'll even have a little bit of butterfly mobility happening right there on the joints that are then helped out by the watcher piece embedded inside, so flexing forwards and back and up and down. Actually, up and down could be a little bit on the better side, but at least the classic functionality of a butterfly joint facing forwards and kind of moving backwards could be found there slightly. Biceps can rotate all the way around, just mind a little bit more of that stiffiness that I mentioned before, to the point where one of my arms, the one here on the right, is a little bit on the tight side, and I get just a little nervous that it's going to pop off or cause a little bit of flexing or warping of the joint, so just handle it with care. And so the elbow joints can also bend all the way up, no problem. It's really when we get to the wrists that I think we have our first major snag, to the point where I feel like they sculpted out this immaculately detailed straw piece that's kind of peering from the underside of the cuff that I was sort of complimenting before, does have its drawback. And the drawback would have to be that the articulation or lack thereof within the wrist is practically nowhere to be found. You can definitely rotate the hand 360, no problem. And the one on my right even has a little bit of a circumstantial detail that I'm not sure is intended, where you'll note that the cuff can actually rotate, but at the same time, I don't think that was meant to happen, because the one on the left doesn't rotate. So I'm like, I think they're supposed to be glued on to the rest of the forearm piece via some kind of glue or something, but because of some situation happening here, or maybe during mass production, mine, technically speaking, has a bit of a QC problem where this one got a little loosened up and can rotate with the wrist, so it at least allows a bit more mobility in that full 360 rotation. But at the same time, maybe that's not supposed to happen in the first place. And then when moving on over to the left hand, which is much more extended here, again, you technically can rotate it, and having the hand be a bit more extended does give you a little bit of added real estate to grab hold of the hand and even bend it inwards and outwards like so via the hinge. But that bending is definitely found and much more flexible and friendly on the left hand. The one that's a bit more on the grip side can barely edge and move inwards and outwards. It's practically nowhere to be found there. So there's definitely some significant trade-offs from one hand to the next. And then when moving over to the mid-torso, we get in a very interesting situation where you do have a mid-torso cut there that can definitely rotate the full 360, but you'll notice that it's semi-ratcheted. It's not meant to be, but it's kind of placed on this rocker that allows it to fully rotate 360 degrees and can definitely crunch towards the back. But you'll notice that they kind of segmented and chiseled away a piece of the torso there on the underside, that when flexing it back in, it kind of pops back into place. And then when crunching, it can't really crunch all the way across. And when you do so, you'll notice that you'll have a very massive gap here towards the back that, for some strange reason, cannot be fixed. Even when reverting it back to its original state like so, you'll notice that you have an awful lot of spacing happening here on the backside. And I don't know if maybe it's because I don't know if it was tooled differently, or if it was placed on a very strange, I don't know if it's a QC problem or what, but I just find like something is aloof there. And at one point, I even thought that maybe this abdominal piece was placed on wrong by accident. Maybe this is supposed to be the back and this is supposed to be the front side. But at the same time, if you look at the orientation and just the way that it's sculpted, I'm like, nah, that's exactly how the torso piece is supposed to be. So I don't exactly know what the problem necessarily is there. Maybe, like I said, it's sitting on the rocker in a very strange way. And that strange placement can also lend a little bit towards the mobility of the obliques, which does manage to nudge slightly, but only when you kind of twist it at an angle. If you're looking for direct horizontal crunching, I've found better in other McFarlane figures in the past. And then when it comes to the waist, you can definitely rotate it to the full 360, but just mind a little bit of tightness via the skirt piece. And any further extension towards the back could be found via the waist, but crunching is almost just as limited as that as the mid-torso. So just mind a little bit of very conflicting notions with the mid-torso articulation. You'd be right in assuming that the skirt piece might have some implications on the top leg joints, because you'll notice right there that they can't really flex all the way up like so right there. And when extending towards the back, they're a bit more on the generous side. But again, I always kind of prefer for legs to be able to rise going forward rather than going backward. And the same thing could be said about the extension on over to the sides. You'll see right there that they most definitely stop short of the 180-degree angle right about right there. And then in regards to the knees here, they can both bend all the way upwards like so. So no real problems to be found right there. But we definitely have some problems rearing their ugly heads in regards to the ankle joints. If you couldn't already tell, we're going to have practically the same problem that we had with the wrist joints, where you do have, especially after some, like, I want to say 3 or 4 passes of the hair dryer, you are able to get the ankles to fully rotate the full 360 via the joint. From what I can tell, kind of peering a little bit from the underside and moving a little bit of the rubberized sort of tendrils of the cloth right here out of the way. From what I can tell, it looks like it's that ankle joint that I like, that cylindrical, much more flushed down one. But at the same time, it's limited and kind of constricted by the way that this rubberized piece of plastic is sculpted all around it to kind of give it the illusion of his outfit there. So again, there's a bit of a trade-off. We have some really cool visuals happening here, but it does kind of hamper down the articulation to where, as you'll note right there, you can blatantly hear how squeaky it is to rotate the ankle all the way around, and then bending it inwards and outwards can only do so much. You'll note right there that I can barely move it down about that far, and then moving it up is a bit more on the generous side, at least for this foot. This one is kind of about the same. It can kind of flex downwards a little bit more, but then you'll notice that barely it can move all the way up like so. Can definitely rotate and sort of incline slightly at the behest of that flush down cylindrical articulation to the ankle, but only ever so much. So your footing is going to be a little bit varied in regards to the Scarecrow, but at least you do have the pointy toesies that can fully bend all the way up like so. So yeah, it was a little difficult to kind of break down this figure, be marveled at the look of the character, how, almost faithful they pulled Scarecrow here from the panels to give him this very iconic, very faithful look to the overall brown suit. Of course, the textures to kind of make a little bit of the cloth and the rope and all of these different little horror theme aesthetics come to life, only to realize that he does result in being a bit more of a statuesque figure, something that McFarlane has already been scrutinized to death up until this point, and Scarecrow is not necessarily a huge difference from that. So I was hoping that maybe we could make up for it a little bit in the accessories department, and there are some bright spots to account for that. You do have this very decrepit looking sickle, which has some really good paint application happening right here on the handle, but to me, I really do appreciate the very rustic look to the metal part of the sickle that kind of curves its way this way. It's made out of a rubberized plastic right there, so you'll notice a little bit of bendy back and forth, but on the bright side, it's at least giving it this really, like I said, very nasty, almost tetanus-riddled look to this sickle that makes me feel like I need to get my booster when touching it. So it's cool to see that you have a really worthwhile accessory to fit into the very naturally gripping hand here on the right. But I think you already know where I'm going with this. My favorite accessory is going to be the skull right here. I mean, look at that. Really well done in regards to the paint applications to give it this very cranial look. The sculpting, they managed to bring their best foot forward here in regards to kind of carving out the sockets for the nose and the eyes and really selling the illusion of this, like I said, it's just something that's going to be terrifying Dr. Crane's victims here. And I really appreciate how they managed to sculpt out the hand so that he can naturally hold the skull in place, especially if you kind of work the thumb into one of the crevices of the cheekbones, right about right there. You'll notice that, yeah, he's just holding the skull right there perfectly in place, and he's all ready to haunt your nightmares and kind of make your worst inhibitions come to life. Again, if you manage to at least compromise a little bit of the footing that he's naturally going to have some slight problems with, considering that, again, those ankle joints could have been handled a whole lot better in the sculpting phase. And it's those articulation problems that unfortunately bring the Scarecrow down to a 7 out of 10. He was legitimately an 8 because of the visuals, but the articulation definitely created a bit of a demerit. And there you have it. 2 of the best McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse figures you can pick up right now to celebrate Halloween. Outside of that spooky holiday, I would argue that these are practically figures that need to speak to you on either a character level or a visual level, because outside of that, you'll note that they both averaged at the 7 out of 10 rating, which means that they're good, but I wouldn't necessarily blame you if you're holding out for a sale, some kind of buy one, get one 50, or get a certain kind of discounted off like Target recently had, where you had to spend a certain amount to get a little bit of a discount, or hell, practically waiting for clearance, since it seems like figures moving on over to clearance is happening a bit more frequently these days. I wonder why. I wonder if it could possibly be a symptom of the current economic state of our goddamn country. Anyways, outside of those very tumultuous market conditions, it really depends on how much of a fan you are of this version of Batman that is being played by Black Mask in whatever kind of property it is lifted from, or if you're looking for a very definitive, comic-accurate Scarecrow like I was. Outside of those facets, I would argue that these are definitely these figures that need to speak on those volumes, because outside of that, I wouldn't necessarily blame anybody for passing them up because they're meant to be checkbox figures. And of course, to me, they were able to not only do that, but also ride on the coattails of being spooky season and kind of fitting the bill for that occasion. And if you managed to celebrate that occasion, let me know down below, what did you guys go as Halloween this year? Or did you even celebrate with any kind of activity, whether it be trick-or-treating, a party, sitting at home, watching horror movies or TV shows, or just kind of, you know, turning on the news, because that's as horrific as it's gonna get. Whatever you guys decided to act upon, let me know down in the comment section below. Where you guys are done there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and I'll see you guys in Turkey Month.